So why don't you call us to order?
Thank you very much, Senator. Order! Alert! From the decks.
And they listen too, Terry. So I'm Bill Romke, otherwise known as U64455, Stadacona 1955, and Naden 1956 and 1957. And the last ship I was on was HMCS Cabot in St. John's, Newfoundland, in case you missed my accent. I am also an old oar, and I want to tell you about the old oars. We came together as an ad hoc group of former UNTDs about 4 years ago, and we've been together ever since. We've had a mess dinner, and we had a dine of the ladies last year, and this is our dry run, an experiment that we're trying this year to see how it works, and we're all very nervous, but please help us to get rid of our nervousness. So the old oars, I want you to meet them. We have two Bobs, Bobby Oar Port and Bobby Oar Starboard. Bobby Oar Port is Bob Wooten. And Bobby Oar Starboard is Bob Duncombe. And I, of course, am Senate Oar. Captain Peter Milsom, who is the only one among us who really knows what he's doing, is Pete Oar. And Jim Maxwell, who was a former, and still is, a geographer and an official with the Department of Mines, is, of course, Geographer. Where is he? He's just coming in the... Yeah. And Grant Thompson, Dr. Grant Thompson, is not here. He brought us together. He couldn't be with us today. And he is, of course, Doct Oar. So those are the old oars, and we just get together to see what mischief we can get into. I want to say to you that we have together today, and thank you all very much for coming. We have people from, I think, all across the country. I know we have them from St. John's, and I think we have them from far and wide. But I want you to know particularly that the Honorable Jim Kinley is here, who is UNTD #1, and the former Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. Jim, would you please acknowledge? Jim was the first UNTD in 1943 and is returning this year with his wife Grace from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. And I want you to also welcome, please, three really historic figures that we have with us today, because we have the children of Henry Larson, who was the captain, as you know, of the St. Roch, the first Canadian vessel to navigate the Northwest Passage. So we have Doreen Larson Riedel, please. And her brother, Gordon. So I want to also say thank you to Senate Broadcasting. We will be taping the whole of today's proceedings, and I want to thank Senate Broadcasting for that, because it is a Saturday afternoon, and we really appreciate them coming. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that Stornoway Productions is here from Toronto. Stornoway Productions is in the process of doing a documentary for TV on the UNTD. Now, mind you, they may slip in a little something about the COTC and the URTP, but basically it's about the UNTD. And so they will be doing clips during the day, and they will be following us up to the speakers' chambers later on. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that there is coffee and cookies. If you go out the rear bulkhead door and you hang a hard port, you will find coffee and cookies. And Jim is pointing to it as I speak. And if you go out that bulkhead door on the side and hang a port, you will find washrooms. I'd suggest having your coffee before you go to the washrooms. That would seem to be the way to go. So it is my pleasure now and my honor to introduce to you the Speaker of the Senate. I'm not going to go through all of the degrees and all of the honors because I would be here far too long, but I have to tell you that he's a licensed member of the College of Psychology in New Brunswick. So if you think he's looking right through you today, he probably is. Noel Kinsella spent 41 years as a faculty member at St. Thomas University, where he taught psychology, philosophy, and human rights. He received an honorary Doctor of Philosophy degree from the Dominican University College, Ottawa, and an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Human rights is a field in which Senator Kinsella has been active. He served as the chair of the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission for 22 years, beginning in 1967, and as president of the Canadian Human Rights Foundation, and he is well known nationally and internationally as a human rights advocate and an academic in such cases as Malcolm Ross and Lovelace versus Canada at the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Without further ado, I want to introduce to you a man that I have worked with and known and come to respect and regard in the 10 or so years that I have been here. We have worked together when we were whips together, and he has held positions in the Senate, of course, as Leader of the Opposition, and now fulfills with a great deal of grace the position of Speaker of the Senate of Canada. Senator Kinsella.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, Senator Rumpke. And let me begin by pointing out that I'm so glad that Lieutenant Commander Terry Christopher is here and that he demonstrates the great dignity that he showed the other night on national television as he called that unruly bunch from the House of Commons to order. But I must say, Bill, this crowd showed far more discipline than your former colleagues on the port side of these precincts. Being Speaker, I'm advised by my colleagues, the Honourable Senators, don't let the word go to your head. They really don't want to hear you speak. So I shall exercise some custody of the tongue and just make a few brief remarks. First of all, on behalf of all the Honourable Senators, welcome to the Senate of Canada. The Senate of Canada is a very, very important part and special part of the three fundamental elements of the Parliament of Canada. The Parliament of Canada is composed of three constituent elements. It's composed of the House of Commons, it's composed of the Senate, and it's composed of the Crown. And last Tuesday night, in that very, very special space of Canada, the Senate chamber, those three elements of our Parliament came together. And it is only on these special occasions that those three elements come together. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you before you leave the Hill today to pay a visit to the chamber. And as you go into the chamber, you can look on the walls and see those absolutely marvelous paintings from the scenes from the First World War. Why are they on the walls of the Senate? Well, they're there because the First World War speaks to Canada really coming to age. Yes, we were technically founded in 1867, 140 years ago, but many feel that the participation of the men and women of Canada in the struggle from 1914 to 1918 demonstrates when we really came of age. We are going to extend a warm welcome after our work here this afternoon to weepers in the what I'm going to call today the Speaker's wardroom, and you are all very warmly welcome to be there a little later. And when you go into the Speaker's apartments, I want you to take special notice of the floor, because the floor is made of teak and ebony, and that's the way they used to build the decks of the old wooden ships. And the metaphor there is that Parliament and these precincts is the ship of state. So with that, in welcoming all the participants of UNTD Rendezvous Canada to Parliament Hill, si vous me permettez d'exprimer souhaiter une bienvenue très chaleureuse à tous les participants et plus particulièrement dans cette salle ici. Ça, c'est la salle des peuples autochtones. This room that we're sitting in is a very special room. It's one of our committee rooms. It is the Aboriginal Peoples Room. And in this room, several of our committees will meet, including, obviously, the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, but also our Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committee meets in this room. So, in a sense, that we should be having this kind of a seminar this afternoon in this particular room seems to me to be an appropriate coincidence. I think that the topic, the Arctic, whose is it anyways, that this conference or this seminar should have been held last week. Why? Because the last Wednesday, was it, Janelle? We had a very senior member of the Russian Federation here, and he had been the head of the government of the Arctic Republic of Sakya, and he fascinated me with his description of the many programs, the Arctic Bridge, the Arctic Games, the Arctic Council, the Arctic Interparliamentary Group, that it clearly indicates that that people are coming to Parliament Hill to talk to parliamentarians about the very subject which is going to be the content of our seminar this afternoon. So to Bill and your committee, congratulations on ordering. This is a very timely discussion. Tuesday night as well, it was a theme in the speech from the throne, as you know. So we are dealing with something very much au courant. And the issues of Arctic sovereignty, and particularly in these times when the waters of the Arctic Ocean become more and more navigable, once again, how appropriate that this is the theme of the seminar this afternoon. And thirdly, and I'll stop with this one, because I was always of the view that it's safer to speak as a historian than as a prophet, but my colleague Senator Romke, who is much wiser, with more experience, he was able to foresee that this would be an appropriate thing. But surely he didn't know that Russian freighter was going to, from the Murmansk shipping line, the Kapitan Sviridov, was going to sail across from Murmansk into Churchill, Manitoba. It arrived this week. So the government of Canada has long held that it has sovereignty over the waters of the Arctic archipelago. For quite some time, however, Canada has neglected the Arctic in terms of development of defense capabilities, scientific research, and support for communities and the people of the North. This week's speech from the throne has clearly reestablished the defense of Canadian sovereignty as one of the federal government's main priorities. Theoretically, at least, state sovereignty is traditionally defined as that state's right to jurisdictional control, territorial integrity, and non-interference by outside states. Now, I know Professor Byers would engage in this, that the post-Westphalian world perhaps is that paradigm is over as well in terms of direct state sovereignty. But nevertheless, states are expected to assume their responsibilities by ensuring territorial control and providing a presence of state authority. The sovereignty of Canada in the Arctic has, however, been challenged, as we all know. In particular, Canada's ability to detect and monitor foreign incursions in its territorial waters, as well as to enforce its claim over the Arctic, is now being questioned. The renewed focus on the Arctic is in large part due to the effects of climate change in the region. According to a report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, co-recipient of this year's Nobel Prize for Peace, climate change in the polar region is expected to be among the greatest of any region on Earth. So the Arctic is extremely vulnerable to climate change, and major environmental, social, and economic impacts are expected to appear rapidly. Scientific experts predict that climate change will not only cause surface temperatures to rise, but will also alter ocean circulation, ice coverage, and sea level. Just this year, the average sea ice extent at the end of the melt season in September was 39% below the long-term average from 1979 to the year 2000. 39% below. So for the first time, the legendary Northwest Passage was fully clear of ice in September. And Professor Byers told me that he had flown over it and could look down and see not snow, but blue water. As the ice melts, the Northwest Passage could become an attractive and a valuable commercial shipping route. Canada's assertion that the Northwest Passage represents territorial waters has, however, been challenged by other countries, which argue that these waters constitute an international strait. Shipping activities will also likely increase as a result of better access to natural resources, both on land and in the marine continental shelf. There are obvious concerns over environmental degradation, control, and regulation of shipping, and the lives and culture of our northern inhabitants must be underscored. So the federal government's presence in the Arctic has become more apparent in recent years. In particular, there has been an increased number of military deployments, and Canada has been at the forefront of Arctic research spawned by the International Polar Year. Canada also ratified the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea in the year 2003. And a significant implication of ratification of this convention is that it will allow Canada to establish the outer limits of its continental shelf beyond the 200 nautical mile limit. But we must submit our claim to the United Nations by the year 2013. And so mapping the continental shelf is and must be a priority for the Government of Canada. Tuesday's speech from the throne expands upon the announcement made in the past year. In particular, the government has announced its plan to build a world-class Arctic research station and confirmed that it will complete comprehensive mapping of Canada's Arctic seabed, expand the size and capabilities of the Arctic Rangers, build new Arctic patrol ships, create a Canadian Forces Arctic Training Center, increase surveillance, and build a deep water port in Nanisivik. The Arctic is a vast and remote territory, and we'll hear lots about that this afternoon. And it's a territory that presents many difficulties in terms of surveillance, regulation, and infrastructure development. Establishing unquestioned state authority over the waters of the Arctic archipelago will not be easy. The speech from the throne, however, has clearly stated that the Government of Canada is firmly committed to defending our sovereignty in our north. With that in mind, let me introduce our first speaker. We are delighted and privileged to have with us this afternoon Dr. Michael Byer. Dr. Byers holds a Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law in the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. His most recent book, Intent for a Nation, which are available Um, the subtitle being, What is Canada For? Dr. Byers is a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail and is a regular commentator on CBC programs, the Current and the National. And he's one of our natural resources in terms of the community of experts on Arctic sovereignty issues. Dr. Byers will talk and focus on geopolitics currently affecting our country and our country's interest in the Arctic. Dr. Byers.
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you. Merci beaucoup. It's a great pleasure to be here. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui à Ottawa. It was interesting when various members of the audience were being introduced. I couldn't help but feel some personal connections. I was born in Grace Maternity Hospital in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I don't know whether you were the Lieutenant Governor at the time, sir, but perhaps your father was. But I certainly am a blue noser in terms of my birthplace, and I was born, of course, with the salt air in my lungs. Another personal connection, I live just a mile from the Vancouver Maritime Museum, and my two sons, who are 5 and 7, if you ever ask them what they want to do on a Saturday afternoon, it's to go and climb around the Saint Roche. That is their most favorite outing. So there's a very personal connection there. I've lived and traveled across this country. I've lived in 6 different provinces. I've been in the north a number of times. Never enough. The place grabs a hold of you. But just so that we all are reminded, we need to remember that we are citizens of the second largest country on earth, with the longest coastline of any country. We are a maritime country, and most of that coastline is in the north. It's also a country that is large in terms of not just its east-west dimensions, but very few Canadians realize that it is just as far from Point Pelee, Ontario, to Alert, Nunavut, just as far between our most southern and northern points as it is between St. John's, Newfoundland, and Tofino, BC. If you've traveled in the north, you know what I'm talking about. This is a vast, spectacularly beautiful place. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I want to just give you a bit of a geography lesson in terms of a voyage that I did last year. Having been born in Halifax, I do find myself on ships from time to time. There's a bit of a pull. And I had the great privilege of sailing through the Northwest Passage. Last October, I boarded the Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker, the Admundson, at Kugluktuk, near the western end of the Northwest Passage. Sailed through the most southerly route of the passage, through Queen Maud Gulf, through Bellot Strait, the Gulf of Bothia, through Fury and Hecla Strait, into Fox Basin, out into Hudson Strait, and then into Frobisher Bay to end my voyage at Iqaluit. 11 days, October 20th to October 31st. And just so you know, I'm going to actually trace the course of that voyage right now. Starting here, through here, there's a narrow strait here, down here, out in. And of course, Iqaluit used to be called Frobisher Bay, although before it was called Frobisher Bay, it was called Iqaluit. That was a pretty lengthy voyage. We were maintaining a steady 14 knots, 24 hours a day for 11 days. Again, it's a big place. Okay, could we maybe move on to the? Thank you. That's good. Here's a slightly different perspective on the north. This is looking straight down, or I guess straight up, depending on where in space you are. But this is the Arctic Ocean. It's a vast expanse of ocean, roughly 1,000 miles across on average. Of course, the route that I just traced on the other map looks rather southern from this perspective. As you can see, we have some fairly large neighbors. We have on our eastern side the island of Greenland, which of course is part of Denmark. Thank you. We have on our western side Alaska, which is part of the most powerful country on Earth. And not so far across the Arctic Ocean, we have Russia, the largest country in the world and a pretty powerful country itself. And there's, of course, another Arctic Ocean country, which we do not have any direct contact with geographically, but that is Norway. Now, as has already been mentioned by the good senator, we are engaged in some jurisdictional claims with regards to the seabed of the Arctic Ocean. And this is being done under the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Under the Law of the Sea, each country automatically has a right to the resources within 200 nautical miles from shore, the exclusive economic zone, which I'm sure you know all about. But in 1982, 25 years ago, the drafters of the Law of the Sea Convention foresaw that at some point in the future, countries would want to exercise control over the resources of the ocean floor beyond 200 nautical miles from shore. In fact, a Canadian Department of External Affairs lawyer named Alan Beasley was absolutely pivotal in the negotiation of those aspects of the convention, allowing for the possibility of coastal states claiming ocean floor jurisdiction beyond 200 nautical miles in those instances where they can establish that the ocean floor is a, quote, natural prolongation of the continental shelf closer inshore. Natural prolongation. And this needs to be done on the basis of two different kinds of scientific evidence. The first with regards to the topography, the shape of the ocean floor. And the second with regards to the geology, the actual minerals, the strata, underneath the ocean, down many kilometers into the Earth's crust. To establish, again, that the ocean floor beyond 200 nautical miles from shore is a natural prolongation of the shelf closer inshore. And there are some complicated criteria by way of which this scientific evidence is to be analyzed by a special commission of scientists at the United Nations who are elected by the various parties to the Law of the Sea Convention. What I've just described in the simplest possible terms is actually a highly refined and very technical peaceful dispute settlement process. Now, the good news with regards to the Arctic Ocean is that all of the Arctic Ocean countries are working within the framework of that peaceful dispute settlement mechanism. Russia has ratified. It ratified the convention in 1997. And each country has 10 years from the date of its ratification in which to file its claim, unless it secures an extension, which Russia did, which means that Russia has until 2009. And this is to map and potentially claim an area that extends basically north of Russia as far as the North Pole, including most of the shallower water, the lighter blue-colored areas on that map between the North Pole and the Russian mainland. It's a big area. And Russia has some pretty serious Arctic maritime capabilities, including a fair number of nuclear-powered icebreakers. And I don't need to tell sailors that an icebreaker is essentially all about how much steel you have in the front and how much power you have in the back. It's a battering ram. And if you have a nuclear reactor in the ship and enough steel in the front, you can go through up to 10 meters of ice. And the Russian vessels can do that. So the Russians can go anywhere at any time, and they will complete their work on time and file a comprehensive claim. In fact, they've already filed a comprehensive claim, and the question is whether or not they will modify or supplement that before their deadline in 2009. Now, the other countries, Norway has already filed a claim. Denmark is working towards a 2012 deadline. Denmark has recently chartered a Russian nuclear-powered icebreaker to break ice for a research vessel, which happens to be Swedish rather than Danish. But Denmark is fully committed to getting the work done on time. And most importantly here, Denmark is keen to map this ridge that goes across the middle called the Lomonosov Ridge, which could potentially be a natural prolongation of the Danish shelf north of Greenland, potentially a natural prolongation of the Canadian shelf, and almost certainly to some degree a natural prolongation of the Russian shelf down here. That's where the Russians actually were this summer when they diverted from that relatively shallow water into the more than 12,000 feet of water directly above the North Pole and engaged in a publicity stunt by using a couple of mini submersibles to plant a Russian titanium flag on the ocean floor. The reason I say that that was a diversion and a publicity stunt was that the Law of the Sea Convention will almost certainly not allow anyone to successfully claim jurisdiction over 12,000 feet of water. There are no sediments down that far. So my own view is that Prime Minister Harper should have sent a congratulatory telegraph to President Putin saying, good job, impressive technological capability. Of course, what you've done is of no legal consequence whatsoever. Now, the United States. The United States has not yet ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. Many people assumed that it never would. But surprise, surprise, President George W. Bush has recently asked the U.S. Senate for its advice and consent to U.S. ratification of the Law of the Sea Convention. Now that's partly because the United States played a very important role in the drafting of that document, including the drafting and renegotiation of a portion that deals with the deep sea bed beyond the outer limit of any coastal state's possible claims. But the point here is that the United States wants in. to this peaceful dispute settlement process, and because the Democrats now control the Senate agenda and the Democrats support U.S. ratification, I expect that this will happen in the next 6 to 12 months, almost certainly before Mr. Bush finishes his second term as president. And in anticipation of U.S. ratification, the U.S. Coast Guard research icebreaker, the Healy, has spent the summer north of Alaska, mapping the seabed over what's called the Chukai Plateau. And that, just so you can see here, is this area here. Now, mapping the seabed in terms of the topography isn't terribly difficult. You can do it with sonar. You can do it from a submarine. And the topography of the Arctic Ocean was mapped during the Cold War, either by the Soviet Union or by the United States. And the United States has recently declassified all of its topographical mapping of the Arctic Ocean seabed. So there's not a whole lot of work to be done there. But you can't map the geology with sonar. You have to do seismic work. And you can't really do seismic work all that well from a submarine. Something about setting off explosives, and I don't really understand the limitations here, but if there are any submariners in the room, I'd be keen to learn about it afterwards. To do seismic work, you either do it from the surface of the ice, drill holes, lower small explosives below the ice, and detonate a whole series of them over time, and then measure the echoes coming back and get some sense as to the underwater geology. Or you do it from a vessel, a surface vessel, ideally a research vessel that is following behind an icebreaker, so there's not the kind of noise that you get from the actual breaking of the ice. And that's what the Danes have been doing, and that's what the Americans have been doing, and what the Russians have been doing, and what Canada should be doing too. And we are doing, to be fair, some of it. We actually mounted a joint expedition with the Danes in 2006, north of Ellesmere Island in Greenland, mapping from the ice, landing on Twin Otter ski planes and doing the detonations through holes drilled in the ice. This summer, a couple of our scientists piggybacked on the Swedish research vessel that was behind the chartered Russian icebreaker, and we actually paid for a couple of days of the charter so that we could get some of the work done from that platform. And the National Research Council of Canada, partnering with the Coast Guard, has been testing the Louis Saint Laurent, the largest and most powerful icebreaker in the Canadian Coast Guard fleet, for the possibility of being used for sonar work northwest of the Canadian archipelago. But it's not clear that that's going to be enough. In fact, the chief scientist in charge of that mission went public a couple of months ago, speaking to journalists, saying that if the slightest thing went wrong, that Canada would miss its deadline. And of course, when you're operating in what is possibly the most inhospitable ocean on the planet, in ice conditions that are still pretty strenuous, particularly because the Arctic Ocean pack is pushed by winds and currents onto the northwest flank of the archipelago. If you're trying to do seismic mapping up in here, you don't want a 40-year-old Gulf of St. Lawrence refitted icebreaker. You want one of those big Russian nuclear-powered icebreakers to make sure that you can get the job done on time. And one of the things that I'm hoping will follow through after the throne speech is more money for this mapping effort. Probably money to charter probably a Russian, could be a Finnish polar class icebreaker to enable our scientists to meet the deadline without any question. And the reason that this is important is, well, first of all, as a country, we will have a legitimate claim to a large chunk of the Arctic Ocean seabed, and I think that we owe our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a claim that defends their rights over time. And on top of that, there's probably an awful lot of oil and gas in the seabed of the Arctic Ocean. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that 25% of the world's undiscovered fossil fuel reserves are located there. Now, before you get too excited about all that oil and gas, it would be a long time before we're actually exploiting that oil and gas. It's a very remote, very inhospitable region, some very bad weather, total darkness for months on end, be a very expensive proposition. And given that we're only able to talk about exploiting that oil and gas because we've been burning so much oil and gas, which is causing the climate to change and therefore the ice to melt, I think we need to be talking simply about exercising maximum jurisdiction so that we keep the options open for future Canadian governments to make decisions 10, 20, 30 years hence as to what actually is done. And who knows, in some distant time, a future Canadian government may decide that it actually is more responsible to leave that oil and gas where it is than to exploit it and burn it and contribute more to climate change. I don't want to prejudge those decisions. I just know that we have an obligation to make as large a claim as possible so that we don't reduce our options in the future. So that's the Arctic Ocean seabed in brief. It's a good news story. It's a cooperation story at the moment. It's a peaceful dispute settlement mechanism. The rule of law is in operation. 25 years ago, some very smart diplomats and international lawyers recognized that they had the opportunity to get in front of this problem and sort it out in advance. Journalists like to exaggerate this, talk about the new Cold War and all that. I worry sometimes that the journalistic rhetoric could become self-fulfilling, but as far as I can tell, within the civil services of the Arctic countries, cool heads are prevailing today. So let's shift to the other issue. Maybe if we could go back to the Adobe, the PDF, that'd be great. It was there, and it's gone. Well, that's okay. Let's go to the next photograph then. Just go down to the bottom and go back. Okay, there we go. This is the Amundsen, named after the Norwegian explorer who was the first captain to sail a ship through the Northwest Passage. He did so in 1906. It took him 3 years, including 2 years locked in the ice. The Amundsen used to be the Franklin when it was used solely as a Coast Guard icebreaker. It was refitted 5 or 6 years ago as a research icebreaker and renamed the Amundsen. And for between 6 and 8 months of the year, its research activities are directed by a consortium of federally funded scientists from every Canadian university and a range of government departments. This consortium is called ArcticNet, and I have the privilege of being the project leader for ArcticNet on the Northwest Passage. And that is why I was able to sail on the Amundsen in October of 2006. She's 300 feet long. She's 30 years old. She's a great ship, but she's aging quickly. And I don't, again, need to tell sailors this, but icebreakers have to do particularly heavy duty. Their job is to actually bash themselves against ice and to rev the engines forward and backward to generate the momentum to do that job. So a 30-year-old icebreaker is an old ship. And I know there are no Coast Guard officers in this room, but your colleagues in the Coast Guard do fabulous service. They do things with duct tape that no one else could ever do. They're absolute professionals, and they are the ones who truly understand how to navigate in ice-covered waters. And it would be, and I'll get to that. Is that a question?
Wasn't that the one that
Mansbridge was on this ship briefly a few months ago. In 2006, he was on the Louis Saint-Laurent, which is the larger vessel. This has been totally refitted. It has a moon pool on the bottom of the hull to now allow instruments and divers to go straight into the water without having to worry about the ice around the vessel. It has dynamic positioning thrusters on the side so it can stabilize itself in a current or in moving ice. It carries a whole series of mobile laboratories that are in shipping containers that can be moved on or off the ship, depending on whether the scientist is going to be on the ship with his or her laboratory. It is Canada's Arctic research platform. I would say that 50% or more of Canada's Arctic research is done from this vessel. And given that, again, we are the second largest country on Earth, and 40% of our country is in the Arctic, this is a pretty important part of what we are. Now this picture was taken in Bellot Strait, roughly 350 nautical miles north of the Arctic Circle. This is on the, I guess it would be the left side of this photograph is the most northerly point on the Canadian mainland. You have to go through Bellot Strait or somewhere further north if you want to sail through the Northwest Passage. So this is if you're taking the southern classic route, this is as north as you go, but it's still 350 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Picture was taken on October 23rd, 2006, and I don't know if anyone has noticed something missing from the photograph. There's no ice. There's no ice. The 40 Arctic scientists who were on board the vessel with me were collectively terrified. The Coast Guard crew, with on average a decade of Arctic sailing experience, was dumbfounded. The captain, with 20 years experience in the Arctic, was so incredulous that he sent the ship's helicopter up with an ice spotter to go and find the ice. I went with the ice spotter. We didn't find any ice. This could be the Bosphorus or the Dardanelles in terms of its width, its depth. Without ice, it's another navigable passageway. And historically, this was clogged with 10, 15, 20 feet of thick, hard, multi-year ice that had survived at least one summer, where new ice had accreted onto it and where the salt had leached out of the ice, turning the ice into something akin to concrete. That was the historic 30, 40, 50 years ago situation here. This was unprecedented. Since this photograph was taken, as the Senator has mentioned, we've lost a lot more ice. In fact, since this photograph was taken to today, according to the European Space Agency and according to NASA, we have lost an additional 1.2 million square kilometers of Arctic sea ice. That's in the last 12 months, from the lowest level, the lowest extent of ice in 2006 to the lowest extent in 2007. There's been a decrease of 1.2 million square kilometers. That's an area larger than the entire province of Ontario. And this has got some really scary consequences for the global climate system, because among other things, the ice acts like a giant reflector and bounces a lot of the solar energy back into space. The solar energy from the sun's rays hit the snow and the ice and go straight back into space, if the ice is there. If instead you have open water, roughly 80 to 85% of that solar energy goes into the water and stays there. And the problem with that is that causes the water to warm even slightly, which causes more ice to melt, which means that there's more open water to absorb more solar energy, to cause more warming and more melting, and you get a vicious feedback loop. That's what it's called, a feedback loop. And that's what's happening in the Arctic. And this will not only cause a lot of the ice to melt in the Arctic, with consequences I'll discuss, but this will cause that warmer water to flow into the other oceans of the world and will change currents and weather patterns. And generally, this is a really bad scene. If you've ever doubted the reality of climate change. That should cause you to stop doubting. And we can talk about what's causing it. We can talk about the fact that the climate has changed in previous periods in history. But this speed of change, 1.2 million square kilometers in 12 months, is faster than anything that's occurred historically. And it would seem to be pretty closely linked to the fact that through human-caused emissions, we have over the last 200 years increased the CO2 percentage in the atmosphere by roughly 35%. The atmosphere being the thin, life-giving skin of the planet. That's my sort of climate change aside, okay? But climate change, it's certainly happening. It seems to be linked to us, and that's the big picture that surrounds the smaller but also important stories that I'm going to tell. Now, if the Northwest Passage is open, and it is open, it's open right now, in our entire voyage in October 2006, we encountered almost no ice. We hit a little bit of very thin first-year ice in Queen Maud Gulf, nothing that would have impeded a regular non-ice-breaking vessel. And we encountered a very loose pack in the Gulf of Bothnia, near the entrance to Fury and Hecla Strait, but nothing that an experienced navigator couldn't have taken even a large cargo ship around. It really was quite insignificant, and this loose multi-year ice had almost certainly drifted down from far, far north. And of course, there's no ice this year. This will be attractive to foreign vessels. In fact, there's already a great deal more activity occurring in Canada's Arctic waters. There were 86 ocean-going vessels active in Canada's Arctic waters in 2006. There were 11 Northwest Passage transits in 2006. 5 of them were by cruise ships. Yeah. I mean, it's happening. The foreign vessels are coming, and those cruise ships were flagged in the Bahamas, in Russia, and of the 86 vessels in total, many of them were non-Canadian flagged vessels. So it's coming. In terms of actual shipping between the Atlantic and the Pacific, it's only a question of time. The Russian ship that came to Churchill last week would not have gone through these waters. It actually would have gone south of Greenland and through Hudson Strait into Hudson Bay. But other vessels in the future will look at this, they'll look at the media reports, they'll go on the Canadian Ice Service website, they'll see there's no ice, and they'll realize that there's a 4,000 nautical mile saving in terms of distance if you go through the Northwest Passage while sailing from, let's say, Shanghai to New Jersey, as compared to the current route through the Panama Canal. Obviously, if you're the captain of a vessel that's too large to go through the Panama Canal, the distance saving is much larger. You don't need to go around the southern tip of South America. 4,000 nautical miles is a lot of time, it's a lot of fuel, it's a lot of money. Ships will come. There's no question. The question is, what kind of controls will they be subject to? Who will be deciding whether a single-hulled tanker should be allowed into these waters, or whether only double-hulled tankers should be there? Who will decide that only vessels that have an approved ice navigator on board can sail through these waters? Because there will still be random chunks of multi-year ice for the next decade or two. Who will ensure that these ships do not empty their ballast tanks when they enter these relatively shallow and protected waters? Ballast tanks that could contain invasive species of various kinds. Just think of the zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. And who's going to make sure that these vessels aren't used for illicit purposes, to smuggle drugs or guns into Canada, or illegal immigrants, or perhaps to traffic weapons of mass destruction or centrifuge components or missile components. If you were North Korea or Al-Qaeda and you wanted to move something nefarious between the Pacific and the Atlantic, you would not want to go through the Panama Canal because you will be subject to scrutiny. But the Northwest Passage, once it's open, will have far less of a policing presence in all likelihood. In fact, it might have far less of a policing presence now. And there's, of course, an international dispute over the status of these waters. Canada's position since 1985 is that the waters of the archipelago constitute Canadian internal waters, not territorial waters, but internal waters. So the status of Bellot Strait would be akin to Lake Winnipeg. Okay? No right of innocent passage, no right of transit passage, full force of Canadian domestic law, environmental, immigration, criminal law. And that position, as articulated by Joe Clark when he was foreign minister, is based upon, first of all, straight baselines drawn between the headlands around the archipelago, and secondly, the consolidation of those straight baselines by thousands of years of Inuit use and occupancy of the ice, because the Inuit as a maritime people actually lived on the ice for 9 or 10 months of the year. That is Canada's legal position today. Our powerful neighbor and our best friend, whether we like it or not, the United States, takes the view that, that yes, these are Canadian territorial waters, but they have and all countries have a right of passage, a right of transit through these territorial waters. And the best analogy I can give you is of a country estate in England, right, where the local aristocrat owns the land in fee simple. But walkers, as they call them, ramblers, hikers, have a right to walk over his land on a footpath for the simple reason that they've been doing so since time immemorial. They have a right based upon usage that does not take away from the aristocrat's ownership, but cannot be closed off by him. That's the Northwest Passage from the perspective of Washington. Yes, these are Canadian territorial waters. Much of the passage, in fact, at certain points, all of the passage falls within 12 nautical miles of shore. Canadian territorial waters. But they argue that the passage constitutes a so-called international strait. And the legal criteria for an international strait are, number one, connects two areas of the high seas. In this case, the Atlantic Ocean and the Arctic Ocean, which then connects through to the Pacific Ocean. And number two, is used for international shipping. Now, Canada's position is that it hasn't been used for international shipping, and that you would need some volume of international shipping to establish that second criterion. The U.S. position is that, oh yes, it has been used for international shipping. In 1969, Exxon, Humboldt Oil, sent the SS Manhattan through the passage. And in 1985, the U.S. Coast Guard sent the Coast Guard icebreaker, the Polar Sea, through the passage. Both times deliberately not seeking Canada's consent. And that, the U.S. argues, is sufficient. Well, until recently, it didn't really matter so much that we had this dispute, because we had 10, 15, 20 feet of thick, hard, multi-year ice, keeping everyone out, except for the most powerful icebreakers. And since 1988, thanks to Brian Mulroney and his close personal relationship with Ronald Reagan, we have had an agreement on icebreaker traffic that has taken the icebreakers, the Canadian and U.S. icebreakers, out of the sovereignty dispute altogether. We've agreed that icebreaker voyages do not in any way affect the legal dispute. So as long as the ice was there, man, we were happy. We agreed to disagree. And then there was, of course, the question of submarines, but the great thing about submarines is nobody knows they're there. So how can they affect a legal dispute if they're not there, or at least not known to be there? And I'm sure that there's a secret agree to disagree policy between the two governments concerning underwater voyages, and I don't really feel the need to see that again because of the covert nature of such traffic. But what happens to that agree to disagree policy when the Northwest Passage looks like this? Go ahead to the next slide. This vessel, the Berserk II, sought to challenge Canada's legal position just a couple months ago. The Berserk II is owned by a small group of Norwegian playboys, fairly disreputable characters with too much money and not enough sense. And they sail around the world's oceans causing problems, getting drunk and putting their drunken antics onto the internet on YouTube. And they thought, because they've been reading in the media about the Northwest Passage, that they would like to be the people who resolve the dispute, right? By destroying Canada's claim. So off they go, and they made a couple of mistakes. They didn't have good legal advice. The first thing they did was they stopped in Halifax and caused some problems there. I gather that the beer flows freely in some parts of Halifax, and they had a little bit too much, and they got into an altercation or two, and lo and behold, the local police discovered that two of them actually had ties with the Norwegian Hells Angels. And these two individuals were deported from Canada and given exclusion orders and told never to come back. The remaining three Norwegian playboys then sailed this vessel up to Thule, Greenland, where the two who had been deported then got back on board, and then they proceeded through the Northwest Passage. We actually have pretty good surveillance over the Northwest Passage, thanks in part to the Inuit, thanks in part to the Coast Guard, thanks in part to the 86 vessels who are active there, and who cooperate with Canada and register under something called NORDREG, our maritime registration system. And we found out that these cowboys were in the passage. And we followed them in terms of kept an eye on where they were going. And when they got to Coronation Gulf in late August, they decided they needed to pick up some supplies. I guess they were running low on beer and pretzels, and so they decided to pull into Cambridge Bay to stock up, but realized that it wouldn't really be a good idea to show up in this small community with two guys who'd been excluded from Canada. And so before they got to Cambridge Bay, they put these two guys ashore on the tundra. And by doing so, of course, violated Canadian immigration law. It doesn't matter what the status of the water is, they set foot on Canadian soil after being subject to exclusion orders. And that opened them up to arrest and deportation, and that's exactly what happened. And it's not very well known. I just happened to be in Cambridge Bay the day after this occurred and had the chance to talk off the record with a couple of Canadian officials, honorable law-upholding officials that you would all be extraordinarily proud of. And as it happens, the RCMP and the Canadian Coast Guard partnered and did a maritime interdiction of this vessel from the Canadian Coast Guard light icebreaker, the Wilfrid Laurier, out of Esquimalt, BC. They were tracked, they were arrested, they were sent home. Canadian sovereignty remained intact. But it would have been a lot more difficult if they hadn't set foot on Canadian soil. And it would have been a lot more difficult if they hadn't set foot in Halifax and been subject to exclusion orders there. Who knows? What if we had done an interdiction and they had not done anything except sail through the passage? Would Norway have defended them diplomatically? Probably not. What if, instead of being this small ice-strengthened yacht, their vessel was instead a Liberian or Panamanian flagged single-hulled tanker? Would that flag of convenience defend them diplomatically? You bet. That's what flags of convenience do. They defend the companies that use their flag in the court of international diplomacy and in courts of law. And had this been a Panamanian flag vessel and had we done an interdiction, Panama would have taken us lickety-split to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg, because that tribunal would have jurisdiction over Panama and Canada in this instance, and we could have been litigating the Northwest Passage right now. The point here is that the threats to our sovereignty are coming. They're coming much faster than anyone expected, and we need to know what we're going to do when the next situation arises. And before that next situation arises, I would suggest that we need to seize the initiative and, among other things, go to Washington and say, look, this is not in your interest either. To have a Wild West scenario along North America's longest coastline is not a good thing when there's so much foreign activity about to take place. Not because the threat is of a foreign military kind. We're never going to war with the Russians over the Arctic, right? We're never going to war with the United States over the Arctic. The principal security threat in the Arctic comes in the form of non-state actors, criminals, terrorists, the environmental threat from rogue tankers of various kinds, right? That's the real threat. And the United States has just as much of an interest in dealing with those threats as we do. And the best way to resolve that is to do what Paul Cellucci, the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, is recommending, to have the United States recognize Canada's claim, and then have the two countries work together to make sovereignty work for Canada and the United States too. That's the solution. That's where we need to go. Bilaterally, in partnership with the United States, but using Canadian sovereignty. And I will close with just one last thought, because I'm probably going over time. Of course, the United States will want something in return, right? Of course. And this is why, the current U.S. ambassador and the current president are not going to publicly concede to Canada's position without some hard-fought negotiations first. What will they want? Well, they will want a commitment, a legal commitment from Canada to allow unimpeded access for all U.S. governmental vessels. They will want a legal commitment from Canada to allow all reputable international shipping companies to use these waters. Again, subject to the controls of Canadian law, but to turn this into a safe international shipping route. That's fair enough. Pierre Trudeau once said that closing off the Northwest Passage would make as much sense as closing off Halifax or Vancouver Harbour. It's the safety that we're concerned about. Security dimension, the environmental dimension. But the ships can come if they come responsibly. And finally, the U.S. government's going to want to see some pretty serious commitment on Canada's part to actually having an effective policing capacity. And this is why I think that Mr. Harper has made some positive announcements with regards to the Northwest Passage. I do think that renovating the old wharf at Nanisivik, at the old mine on northern Baffin Island, was a good move. We need a resupply deep water facility in the Arctic. I think renovating the existing barracks at Resolute Bay for cold weather training is a good idea. This is a big cold country. We need a cold weather trained Canadian forces. I'm a little bit more skeptical about the ice-strengthened patrol vessels for the Navy, not because I don't like the Navy. I just happen to think the Coast Guard's got the experience to do the Arctic work. And again, the principal threat up here is not foreign navies. What you need is a multi-purpose vessel that can do all the other stuff that the Coast Guard does, including maintaining navigation devices, and yet has the capacity to put 4 or 5 or 6 men on the deck of a foreign vessel to do an interdiction by force if necessary. Essentially, you need a couple of new Coast Guard Arctic vessels, and probably a Comrant search and rescue helicopter, a Canadian Forces helicopter stationed at Resolute Bay. That would be the kind of enforcement capability that, coupled with increased surveillance to augment our existing capabilities, would actually be convincing to our American friends. Because their worst case scenario is recognizing Canadian sovereignty in the Northwest Passage and then seeing us do nothing. Because then no one would be in charge. At the moment, their argument of an international strait at least allows them the possibility of doing some of the enforcement themselves. So unless we can convince them that we're up to the task, that we're fully committed to exerting the necessary presence, they're not going to make any kind of concession at all. So if any of you are friends with Stephen Harper, please tell him, you know, you're doing more than anyone since Brian Mulroney on this file. But the next step is to actually send some very senior people to Washington to talk this through and to figure out how we can protect Canadian and U.S. interests by using Canadian sovereignty before the Canadian sovereignty argument is fatally undermined. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Professor Byers, we have mics set up here, if you don't mind going to them so we can...
And also recognize that my colleague here is going to lose some of his time if we go too long. But I'll take a few questions as quickly as I can.
Could I just ask about the Americans accepting the Canadian claim to the Northwest Passage? We have always read that one of the factors that operates against that, that persuades them not to recognize the claim, is their concern about the application of the principle to other bodies of water throughout the world. Is that not a factor in your eyes?
It's a factor, although I think our American friends exaggerate that dimension for a couple of reasons. First of all, this passage, the passage that was up there beforehand, has seen almost no international traffic, which is distinguishable, therefore, from other international waterways that are recognized as international straits. Secondly, this passage has historically been rendered impenetrable by thick, hard ice, which makes it distinguishable from other passages, most other passages worldwide. And finally, many of the issues that the United States are worried about in this context are resolved by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So I don't think that the U.S. is going to buy my argument or Mr. Salucci's argument until they ratify UNCLOS. But as I've said, President Bush is now seeking to do that. Is the American position, is it a significant concern? Yes. Can we work around it? I think so. One of the things that we would want to do in the bilateral agreement is state explicitly that this bilateral agreement between Canada and the United States would not have any precedential impact with regards to any waterways elsewhere, and get as many of our allies, including all of our NATO allies, to endorse that clear expression. It's not going to be easy. One of the things that I'm planning on doing early next year is to actually convene a group of retired Canadian and American diplomats and a few academics to actually sit down for a couple of days and see if we can draw up a model agreement that we could then take to both governments and say, look, this is a good starting point. We spent 2 days trying to work through the issues, and we think that it's now time for this to be taken over at a formal level. No, it's not going to be easy, but I don't see how we have any choice.
Within the last month or so, one of us old Arctic hands wrote a letter to some of the national newspapers referring to the proposed Arctic patrol vessels, ice strengthened, as slush breakers. Now, he was exaggerating, I think, but he had a point. if Canada is really serious about operating in the Arctic and in exercising 100% sovereignty, you have to be able to go where you want, when you want, all the time. So shouldn't the Prime Minister be serious about all the things he's saying, be starting the planning now for building at least one Polar 8 or Polar 10 icebreaker? I think there was, about 15 or 20 years ago, a group set up to actually start the design and planning for one, and then it was canceled.
Yeah. There was actually a contract signed with a shipyard in North Vancouver to build the Polar 8, and that was canceled.
So if Mr. Harper's serious, shouldn't that be reintroduced quickly?
Yeah, we don't need a Polar 8 anymore because there's much less ice than there was in the mid-1980s. So there's some cost saving available through climate change. But we need an icebreaker that can move through 3 to 4 feet of ice at speed and break through ridges up to 15 feet thick. Okay, and we need a couple of those, and they need to be new. In terms of the slush breakers, I mean, you're the people with experience on this. I have difficulty imagining that any responsible captain would take such a lightly strengthened vessel thousands of miles from the nearest port in such an inhospitable region with the possibility of there being chunks of thick, hard, multi-year ice still floating around. I think these patrol vessels will be enormously helpful in Baffin Bay, in the southern Beaufort Sea, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And of course, they will be fully capable of going to non-ice-covered regions of the world and doing the kind of role that our frigates now do. And when it comes right down to it, I suspect that that's part of the reason we're getting these ships. I think that that D&D is actually getting a handful of new frigates under the guise of Arctic vessels and perhaps raiding a budget that might otherwise have gone to the Coast Guard. But that would be cynical and simple speculation. I don't think the government departments compete for funds between themselves, do they?
This will have to be our last question.
I was wondering to what extent your model agreement between Canada and the United States might be based on the existing agreements governing St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, our seaway, including the International Joint Commission, which has settled a lot of thorny questions since 1911.
You know, great minds think alike, sir. And in August, I wrote an article in the Globe and Mail suggesting just that. And I'm pleased to say that the first person to phone me about that article was Mr. Herb Gray, the Canadian chair of the International Joint Commission, simply recognizing that perhaps that model of binational cooperation might indeed make sense, although in a different context. But think very briefly about the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's a significant international waterway of great commercial importance that passes through the sovereign territory of 2 separate states. And it works. I mean, the St. Lawrence Seaway is not an international strait. St. Lawrence Seaway, through significant portions of its course, passes through internal waters. And yet it works. And it works because the 2 countries have recognized that it's in their mutual interest to have this international waterway passing from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Thunder Bay. And vessels from any country in the world can use that waterway provided that they comply with the shipping and safety regulations in place. That's the model. The Northwest Passage is the St. Lawrence Seaway of the 21st century, or at least it should be in terms of how we think diplomatically about the resolution of this. Thank you.
On your behalf, let me thank Dr. Byers, and we'll have an opportunity to carry on bilateral discussions with him as the evening progresses. But now we want to introduce and call to the podium Captain Serge Bertrand. Captain Bertrand is the Chief of Staff of the Maritime Staff Headquarters here in the nation's capital. The captain graduated from the Royal Military College in 1978 in engineering physics, and he has extensive experience across the Navy, serving at sea on the decks of our destroyers and tankers and many of the headquarter operations of our armed forces. He's conducted operations off Haiti and Rwanda, but I think he deserves a special medal as all of those who went out when the Red River was flooding its banks and lugged those sandbags and did such a great job there.
Threw my back out for 2 months. So
The captain's going to come and share his views with what the Navy's perspective is in terms of our maritime strategy, particularly as it relates to the Arctic. Captain Bertrand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, distinguished senators, ladies and gentlemen, naval colleagues. Wait a second, gentlemen, naval colleagues, that should not be considered as mutually exclusive. It's a real delight to be here with you today, and it's with some trepidation that I share the podium with such a distinguished and learned colleague as Dr. Byers. I'm not going to be speaking as much on the Arctic as he has, but rather to leverage what he has shared with us in order to talk about how the Navy is evolving its strategic vision around the defense and security needs that we see ahead of us now and into the next 2 to 3 decades. That will touch on the Arctic in a couple of instances, and we can certainly deal with those in the question period. But my sense is that what would be more useful in an exchange with former practitioners and a current one is an exchange of ideas on how we in the Navy look at today's world and how, as part of the Canadian Forces, we will provide an instrument to fulfill the government's will. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about. I have a distinguished colleague in support. Peter is going to be clicking my slides for me so that I can walk around the room. And let me just check. Yeah, I've got laser technology working for me now. Thanks to all the team in terms of the video and audio who have put this thing together. I guess we're a trial run. And I understand the cameras are rolling, so I won't be able to claim later on that if this thing doesn't work that I'm really Dave Hudock, who should have been here today rather than me. Anyways, if I can have the first slide, please, Peter. Okay. First of all, a paid message from my sponsor, Admiral Robertson, and talk about some of the activities the Navy's been up to, both at home and abroad, over, say, the last 18 months or so. So we're going to brag a little bit about what we do. On the left-hand side, a laydown of the type of constabulary work that the Navy does in support of other government departments, literally 365 days a year, 24/7, around the clock. And leading down to about halfway down that slide to the great business of navies, which is to be prepared as an instrument of war. And there's a significant amount of work that goes into that, and it gets ever more complex with each passing decade. And then finally, as a nod in terms of the theme of the Arctic, just a few words about Operation Nanook, an exercise that was conducted earlier this year in the North with a full range of government departments in order to figure out what a whole of government implementation scheme for Northern security would be all about. And so we were working with the RCMP and the Coast Guard and others and doing boardings of naval teams from those vessels and vice versa in order to do the type of maritime interdiction piece that Dr. Byers described a little earlier with the Berserk II. On the other side, operations abroad, Op Chanabel,
Commander Gilles Couturier, who was the CEO of Fredericton, is about to go in November to New Orleans to receive an award for policing excellence for the work that he and his ship's company did in supporting the Royal Military Canadian Police in a drug bust that took place off the coast of Africa over a period of 70 to 90 days. And we've heard from our RCMP colleagues that the fact that the ship was able to maintain operational security, or OPDEC, because the lives of undercover police in the east end of Montreal depended on the ship's company maintaining secrecy, is what led to the ultimate busting of that ring and making the east end of Montreal safe for the kids that live there. So that's going to be happening next month. Op Altair, which is the Canadian maritime contribution to the ongoing global campaign against terrorism. Ottawa returned from that deployment recently. Her captain is now an indentured slave to the Admiral as his executive assistant. But from that deployment, for which he has just received a meritorious service medal, his American boss, the commander of the Expeditionary Striking Group, USS Boxer, basically had him as his second in command. So good was he and his team in comparison to their American colleagues that Ottawa was their go-to ship. And the CO felt so, or the commander felt so strongly about that when General Hillier was in theater to visit Ottawa, among others, that commander went about 6 to 8 hours out of his way in order to speak to General Hillier for 15 minutes on the job that Ottawa was doing on deployment. We were the first nation to command the new NATO High Readiness Maritime Force, the Standing Maritime Response Group 1, and the Athabascan and Iroquois, who remain the gold standard for command and control vessels, were the first two ships to do that. And they supported then Commodore Rouleau, who was the Canadian in command of that force at the time. More recently, you will have seen some very dramatic images from the bridge wings of HMCS Toronto in her current deployment with that very same formation. The dramatic rescue of Yemeni personnel pulled from the sea in the Red Sea. And that strategic effect of beaming those images around the world were just a reflection of the type of stuff that navies do day in and day out, not only here but quite literally around the world. Then finally, again, exercises with our international partners. I've indicated 2 there. And then finally, it would not be complete if I wasn't able to beam a little bit about the fantastic work that our clearance divers are doing in Afghanistan to counter the threat against mines and bombs, what we call in the lexicon IEDs, for improvised explosive devices. That's a real to and fro battle of technology, and our Navy clearance divers from both Victoria and Halifax are playing a key role in keeping our soldiers safe. Okay, enough of that. Let us go and move on to the next slide, if we could, Peter. Thanks. I want to show you the landlubber's view of the world. There's nothing going on in the oceans because generally politics doesn't happen there. There are some exceptions, and when President Putin takes off his shirt on a fishing trip and tells his boys to go and plant a titanium flag and other things like that, and sail the backfire regiments and the bearer bombers, I start feeling awfully nostalgic, because that's the war, the Cold War, that I grew up and served for most of my career. What the map shows here is that most of the people live within about 100 nautical miles of the world's oceans. And those oceans provide to us strategic depth for defense against aggression at a distance. The scope for strategic and operational maneuver. In other words, the ability, the priceless ability for operations to pick the time and place of action. And then finally, the freedom and independence to act without having to rely on shore-based partners or putting yourself in a position of risk because you need to defend territory. Next. Whoa, what happened there? All of a sudden now, the oceans have filled up. What you're seeing here is a 48 to 72-hour composite of navigation radars, both sea-based and air-based. That's what all those little dots are. And all those little dots are filled with things. Things that we as consumers enjoy. And I would just like you to reflect for a second on what you had for breakfast this morning or for lunch earlier today, and what perhaps we will enjoy this evening. Where did those goods and services come from? Well, chances are they came in the hull of one of 50,000 vessels of trade, which are literally connecting every country in the world in a highly complex, highly interdependent, highly vulnerable global system of just-in-time supply that has made neighbors of all the peoples of the world. Now, keeping the seas free in order for us to be able to enjoy the benefits of the prosperity that that brings is the job of navies. Next. When disruptions occur to that global system of supply, the ripples it causes can literally wash around the world with ever-cascading effects. And people at the postgraduate school in Monterey have been studying those effects and the costs to economies of those effects ever since the first Persian Gulf War. And using a form of economic analysis or regression analysis keyed in on the costs of futures of various kinds of commodities, they were able to demonstrate, for example, that the prompt dispatch of maritime power by the coalition in Persian Gulf War saved the OECD nations roughly $70 billion US in terms of the depression in costs on oil futures. They've continued to do that work ever since on other instances of naval crisis response. But if you look at the Canadian share of that, about half the cost of the frigate program that was then underway was achieved through that single action of deploying 3 ships at the time. Very powerful stuff. Next. So if you take those 2 pictures and put them together one beside the other, you get a sense of the strategic functions that navies perform. On the one hand, they deliver maritime security, both independently and collectively. And it's a very fair comment to say that Canada's Navy is very much in the business of safeguarding Canadian prosperity. We underscore our way of living, our standard of living, by the work we do both at home and abroad. And the second piece that navies do is to project the influence and power of the nation abroad. And why that is so key is because there is a significant public discussion underway now in terms of what that should be. What is the role that Canada should play in the wider world that is commensurate with its vital interests as well as its gifts as a nation? That is an extremely important discussion. And the extent to which we all participate in that will make for an ever richer result. If I can go to the next slide. So, we're back to Canada now, and the comment that Dr. Byers made that Canada is a maritime country. Well, it is one of the world's great coastal states, with one of the world's largest economies of which 1/3 of the wealth that is produced is dependent on maritime industry and trade. 1/3 of one of the world's greatest economies depends directly on the sea. And for his benefit, I pulled up some pictures of the Vancouver Port Authority, his stomping ground, and just to underline that this is the stuff that we don't see, but that's the stuff that gets our goods overseas and brings other goods to us so that we can enjoy them as consumers. In the bottom left-hand corner, when you step back far enough from even the largest country in the world, you realize that it's in an island continent. And the fact that our biggest trading partner is the United States is absolutely immaterial to the dependency of both countries on the sea. And then finally, some colors in the bottom right corner to show that the waters that we claim as either internal or territorial, as well as the economic exclusive zones to which we have obligations and jurisdictions, will, depending on the claims that Dr. Byers was describing earlier, will be as large as the landmass itself. That's a honking lot of water. And keeping that water safe is the job of a range of actors, of which the Canadian Forces and the Navy is but one humble part. Next. Okay, so what I would like to show here is that sovereignty and security are outcomes of very specific activities in which the Navy plays an ongoing role. Surveillance, the ability to know what is happening, where and when. The ability to deploy your forces precisely where you need them. And then finally, the ability to control events at sea. Those three things are what operationalize Canadian sovereignty and security. Now, the pictures that I've shown here, these are pulled from our operational information network. And those little white dots are vessels of some kind. Just out of curiosity, I called down to Maritime Forces Atlantic and Maritime Forces Pacific on Wednesday to find out how many vessels we're actually tracking through all source means. Marlant came back and told us, well, we've got 1,302 on the plot today. MARPAC came back and said, we got 797. It's that the Canadian Forces brings to the mix. Knowing what's going on out there, and then being able to do something about it. Then there's a range of pictures at the bottom. It's just intended to show you that we're not the only actors in this business. That in fact we work very closely with the RCMP and with immigration and with the Coast Guard, because it really is a whole of government approach that we are pioneering here. And I'll tell you what, there is no country in the world that does this intergovernmental cooperation piece better than Canada. There is no country in the world that can pull together as complete a picture as Canada. The United States and countries around the world come to us to figure out how we do it. It's something that we all ought to be very proud of. Next. Where that all happens are in these so-called Maritime Security Operations Centers, which were blistered on the side of our Maritime Operations Centers as an interim capability a couple of years ago. And these are being developed and progressed to a full operational capability within the next 2 to 3 years or so. And there you'll have all the government departments have their representatives there, and that's the glue that allows us to coordinate the efforts of all the players together. Next. The Arctic. Well, the Arctic is a maritime theater of operations. That is why the Navy cares about the Arctic, and the issues that are playing out at the geopolitical level, at the political level, at the strategic level, matter a whole lot to the Navy. Because just like citizens across the country, there is a deep and abiding sense of stewardship for our North that we share as an institution that all Canadians demonstrate. So we are really pleased with the government's recent announcements about doing something about the far North. But clearly, when you look at all that, the key issues revolve around water space and the legal regimes that apply to those water spaces, because aside from Hans Island, no land in the Arctic is at dispute. Next. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the away game, if I could, projecting influence and power abroad. Peter, if I could have the next slide. Maritime forces provide tremendous options to policymakers. For one thing, they can be raised to high readiness and maintained there for months and months at a time. Dr. Byers mentioned that when he was recently in Victoria, he saw he was surprised to see a half-dozen frigates alongside. And I countered and said, yeah, but the task group can go from that to deploying anywhere in the world in 10 days. There's no other CF capability that can do that. When armies generate capability, they must deploy or they erode quickly. So having that ability to maintain a high level of readiness over an extended period of time is a significant option developer for governments. We're globally deploying and self-sustaining. We do not need C-17s to get us anywhere. All the stuff that supports armies in the field is inside the hull numbers of every ship, in particular when it's been supported by an underway replenishment vessel. When a task group goes to sea, it can do a range of activities because it has been trained for combat. It is not trained to execute a single mission, but a range of missions from humanitarian assistance to combat operations, and the difference between one to the other is literally 6 minutes. Because when the general alarm sounds, the entire ship's company is at full power, weapons and sensors manned in 6 minutes. That's as quick as it takes. There's no other CF asset that can challenge the absolute responsiveness and flexibility of maritime power. What else does maritime power do for policymakers? Well, first of all, you can deploy a ship without having made a decision. In fact, governments in Canada have done that ever since the Second World War. It allows you to choose the time and place of action. Sailing a ship doesn't mean that you are landing somewhere the next day. You have flexibility to allow political issues in the theater to resolve. And then finally, maritime power can be as easily withdrawn as it can be committed. And again, maritime power is unique in that capacity. Next. Okay, with respect to maritime security environment, just a few comments here, because time is moving on. Next bullet, please, Peter. The world's oceans are becoming places of politics. The vast majority of resources, whether they're in the water column or in the seabed, have now been enclosed through economic exclusion zones. And as a result of exploitation and pressures, these will become increasingly important to every coastal state in the world. So politics will become increasingly important at sea over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Next. There is a range of non-state actors that are at sea in ways and means that we haven't seen before. Piracy is an ongoing concern. In the Straits of Malacca last year, over 270 instances of piracy. And we're not talking little fishing boats, we're talking about liners. That's a real concern. But at sea, as everywhere else, The longer you range out, the more important states are. So if I can have the next bullet. American maritime power remains preeminent. There is no challenger to the United States Navy probably for the next 40 to 50 years. Now that does not mean that there aren't regional navies who will be able to challenge for control in their neighborhoods. And in fact, we're seeing with China, with India, and others, significant capacity being built there. These players are also becoming increasingly competent, thanks to a global arms race, particularly with submarines, where the French and the Germans in particular have provided highly sophisticated submarines with enormously effective weapons and complete turnkey solutions, cradle to grave, for maintenance and support. That is something fundamentally new that's emerged in the last 5 to 10 years. And then finally, there are many areas, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, where maritime disputes simmer on a slow boil. Next. Our Navy, to meet those kind of challenges, must remain centered on a task group. The task group is the minimum set of capabilities that Canada needs in order to be able to exercise independent and sovereign action on the world stage, whether it's in defense of the continent or in its international interests overseas. It's also the best balance of capabilities to provide options over the complete spectrum of warfare. Let's move on to the next slide, Peter. This is the fleet that we are building over the next 10 to 15 years in order to meet the demands of the international environment. I recognize there's a lot there, so I'll walk you through it quickly. Peter, if I can have just the next bullet. First up is the Joint Support Ship. These are to replace the Protector and Preserver, our underway replenishment ship now. The Joint Support Ship will not only be able to meet the tactical level needs of the Canadian Task Group, but will be able to provide enhanced support for operations ashore in a way we simply can't do now. First one of those will be along in about 2012, 2013. Next. The Halifax class modernization announced by the Prime Minister this summer. The Halifax class have served the country superbly in the first half of their lives. They are about to enter the second half of their lives. And this modernization is all about keeping them effective for that second half of service to the country. Next. The Arctic Offshore Patrol Ship, which I will talk about presently. Next. Replacing the Iroquois class. The Iroquois class are the heart of our task groups. That is where the flag officer resides. That's where he commands that enormous set of capabilities of the task group. It's what defends the other platforms from threats from the air. The Iroquois class are now over 40 years old. They're going to be in their 5th decade of service by 2010. They are coming to the near end of their service lives. They must be replaced. If they are not replaced, then Canada will not be able to deliver the type of task group which it currently enjoys. Next, we need to begin to think about what will be the follow-on to the Halifax class, because navies take a long time to build, as you know very well. And then finally, we need to begin thinking about what ultimately will replace the current fleet of submarines that we own. What you should get here is that it takes a long time to build a navy. A long time. And the decisions that led, for example, to Commodore Robertson, who was then the East Coast Fleet Commander, to deploy within weeks of the attacks of 9/11 as Canada's initial response in the War on Terror. The fact that policy decision makers could exercise that option can be traced to decisions that were made by governments in the 1960s. And so when we go to government today, we're talking about the operational implications of a capability that will be with the nation in 2040, 2050. Next. The Arctic Offshore Patrol Ship. We've talked a little bit about this. This vessel is about capacity for the Canadian Navy. As Dr. Byers mentioned, at the moment, a lot of our work, a lot of our constabulary work is centered on the frigates and the destroyers. They are the ones that provide the armed escort or armed support to the other government departments. The Arctic Offshore Patrol Ship is about giving the Canadian Navy capacity so that our Greyhounds can do other business. And if you want, these really finish the job of the Kingston class, which was constrained to cost in the 1990s. And so they are largely a constabulary vessel. They are designed exclusively to support other government departments. They are constabulary in nature. They are not combatants. They will not do anti-submarine warfare. They will not do air defense warfare. They won't be doing anything but supporting other government departments. The fact is that we're going to design them to operate in 3 oceans. We already know, and we've been told that the Arctic is an extreme environment. Well, we know as sailors that the North Pacific, Queen Charlotte's in November or December, or the Grand Banks in January, are extreme environments. And the technical design challenge of this vessel is going to be a rare and pretty one indeed. But the concept here is constabulary with the capacity to operate in the North in the summer when it matters, but otherwise to operate in the Pacific and Atlantic, because that's what we need in order to support the other government departments. Next. Okay, so I'd like to close off with some policy considerations at the strategic level. And if I can just down to the second bullet there. I've mentioned that, just go back, thank. Sovereignty at a simple sailor's practical purpose is an outcome of knowing what's going on, being present when it matters, and then being able to control events at sea. It doesn't matter if we're talking about off of Baffin Island, or in the Dixon Straits, or off the Grand Banks. It doesn't matter. Those are the irreducible requirements. Next, we must be able to respond or be prepared to suffer the assistance of our closest friend and ally. Navy taking a long time to build, I painted that picture. And then finally, there is a whole lot of business to be done in building this Navy and the other government fleets. Our estimates are in the order of $25 to $35 billion worth of business to be done over the next 10 to 15 years in order to go from the fleet we have now to the fleet of tomorrow. That kind of investment is not just about giving options to policymakers. What we're talking about here is building a country. And shipbuilding is not an agricultural industry. It is high-tech over a whole range of sectors. And our Halifax class are a typical example of that. Many nations in the world would dearly love to have ships that capable. Well, that was Canadian industry that delivered that. And what we're looking to try to achieve in what we see now is a marriage between government and industry to invest in the country for the country. In closing, go ahead, Peter. The Navy that Canada needs can deliver on operations both at home and abroad and is responsive, relevant, and effective. That's the Navy Canada needs. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude my chat, and I'm willing to entertain whatever questions you may have. Thank you very much.
You want to take questions? Go to the mic, please. Here you are, sir.
Captain Beltran, I was very interested in your last picture. It's the only one that showed human beings in action. And when all is said and done, I think if you're going to build a Navy, you have to build along the capacity of the people that will build and maintain it and run it. And what is being done to foresee the personnel needs of all these ships and other bits of equipment?
Well, you remember that I started by bragging about our people in the first instance. And one thing I didn't talk about is that capacity of a Navy is a delicate balance between equipment, infrastructure ashore, resources for readiness training, and the people themselves. And getting that balance right is what translates into tactical excellence. Well, I'm damn proud of what we as a Navy do, because we are acknowledged by navies large and small around the world as being the best or among the best ton per ton anywhere. And the reason for that is our people. And we invest very heavily in them. And in fact, Canada's Navy training establishment is among the best and most sophisticated in the world. And it's that training establishment which allows us to translate the equipment and doctrine and procedures and tactics that we have into excellence at sea.
Yeah, I was not thinking so much the present state, but you know, the population first, we have a graying population. Life at sea is very, very hard. And, you know, thinking 25, 30 years ahead, is anything being done along those lines?
Yeah, in fact, our head of Navy personnel has been charged by the head of our Navy to develop a strategic human resources plan that will look at the Navy that we have in 2020 and 2026, and how do we work to bring the people in and to provide them the prospects of an enriching and challenging and rewarding work environment like I've been able to experience. I don't think there's any easy answers there. We understand that we're in a very competitive marketplace. We understand that the types of skills that we're looking for can be easily remunerated elsewhere at a higher level. But here's our competitive advantage. The Navy is a shitload of fun. And we go everywhere, and we do a whole lot of stuff. And you know what? There's lots of Canadians who still have a deep and abiding commitment to serve their country. Those are the ones that we're after. The rest of them, we don't really worry about. Now, having said that, we need to accommodate shifts in values and expectations and all that sort of stuff. But this is an issue that the senior leadership grapples with quite regularly.
Suggest that they bring back the UNTD.
There you go. I don't know if I'll take that one on. Sir.
Yeah, I had the enjoyment recently of reading two books relating to Canada and its military. One by Jack Granatstein, I'm really familiar with him, and one by Andrew Cohen. Now, well, Canada slept this week, I'd like to get back to it. Now, what came through in both books is the question of when they dealt with the military. The distinction between what we have been known for in the early post-war years as a peace builder, peacekeeper, and what the two of them seem to want us to think more of, and that is national interest. And I think Cohen even goes to the extent of saying nobody talks about Canadian national interest. I'm just wondering what your own view is in relation to those sort of two poles of thought. Peace building, being the Boy Scout, as Chrétien would have said, around the world, and that we do have national interests and they have to be defended.
Those are often presented as opposite ends of a pole. But I wonder if we need to just think that through just a little bit. And here's why. Yes, realists tend to think in terms of power and vital interest. Liberal theorists tend to think in terms of values. But here's the thing, from this simple sailor's perspective. As a liberal Western democracy, do not the values and norms upon which the international system is currently built, are these not deeply and abidingly part of Canada's interest? Of course they are. So when people talk about the projection of Canadian values, and whether they put a label like peace building as opposed to war making on it, I think that's what they're talking about. And the whole discussion of Canada as a middle power in terms of its military, economic, informational, and diplomatic domains of influence misses the point. Canada has a vital interest in the international system, and it is not on the sidelines in that system. And so I think that there is a view of Canada that, for me, says we are enormously gifted as a nation. We are privileged with an incredible population, education, standard of living, and that we have tremendous things to offer. And it's more than rhetoric. And so that's what there's a tremendously enriching debate emerging about exactly what role Canada ought to play in the wider world. And I say, great, because this is very important. This is very important to the health of Canada as a country.
I ask that the last three questioners put their questions, the executive summary version of it, and Captain Bertrand, maybe you wait until we hear both questions.
Captain Bertrand, about the Iroquois class replacements, the status of it. I was recently on board Athabasca and I was very impressed, but those ships are, as you point out, pretty old. And the Sea King wasn't able to carry out its mission. And I know the ship is doing the best with what it has, but they were using small personal computers because they don't have the space for brand new fancy computers.
Mm-hmm.
And the next question?
I'm Captain Bertrand. I'm somewhat skeptical of the vessel, the design of the vessel, and the capability that you're planning for the Arctic patrols. Now, I guess I come from it from two perspectives. As a member of the Coast Guard, we nearly lost a medium icebreaker off of Copper Mine that was holed by multi-year ice in relatively open waters.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I was part of the Maritime Museum when we sent a 65-foot aluminum-hulled RCMP catamaran through the Northwest Passage 7 years ago, following the southern route in basically ice-free waters. I'm just wondering, in looking at this particular vessel, as to whether or not you've gone back and seen if we can get a couple of HMCS Labradors instead. A vessel that can handle ice, a vessel that is good for interdiction, a vessel that is armed, and a vessel that can obviously handle both the North Atlantic and the Pacific. And I guess the second part of my skepticism is, where in God's name are you going to get the people who have the expertise of operating in icy conditions when you really face them on the shoulders of your nice summer ice-free seasons? You know, you need something more than vessels that can putter along through the equivalent of a Tim Hortons iced cappuccino.
Is that with or without cream?
I prefer with a low fat.
Listen, I hear what you're saying. But we didn't get stupid when you left the mob. Okay? And we got lots of people that can draw on a global maritime design community to help us out. And so that's how we're going to do it, is we're going to, and parenthetically, the Coast Guard is being enormously helpful in providing us advice in how you go about stating requirements for the vessel. And so we consult with them, and we're going to school with them on this thing. And we're very much beholden to them. As opposed to your other question, how on earth are you ever going to learn? Well, the old-fashioned way, one day at a time. And the Coast Guard's going to help us. On the Iroquois, all I can say is, yes, old, hull systems in tough shape, but combat effective, wow. Those ships, in terms of air defense and command and control, are among the most capable in the world. And so here we have this very effective capability, but it's dying on us, and by 2015, we figure she's done. And that's why we need to replace those hulls just as soon as we can. Yeah.
The harbor pilots outside there waiting on us, and the tides is ebbing on us. Thank you, Captain. And then just before I call on Senator Romke to take the podium, a final observation by Dr. Byers.
This is a purely selfish intervention. My publisher, Douglas and McIntyre, insisted that I bring 12 copies of my book to this event. One of them is going to the speaker directly beside me. But
the Library of Parliament.
But the other 11 copies I do not want to have to schlep back to Vancouver. They are actually the book that the captain here was describing in terms of the vision that he and I share of Canadian foreign and defense policy. It's a book that responds to Jack Granatstein and Andrew Cohen. There's a second subtitle that you haven't yet heard, A Relentlessly Optimistic Manifesto for Canada's Role in the World. There's a chapter on the Arctic. There's a chapter on U.S.-Canada military relations. There's a chapter on Afghanistan that I'm sure many of you will disagree with, but I've written this book to be deliberately provocative. This is a fantastic country, and we have so much to do, and obviously the Navy will play a very important role on that. The books are discounted. They're regularly $33, and they're $25, and please help me out. Thank you.
So in turning the gavel over to my colleague, Senator Romke, let me just put on the record my appreciation for what Senator Romke has done to put this together. And to you, Captain Bertrand, let me just underscore that the morning after the Toronto pulled from the Red Sea, the Yemeni people, unfortunately there were some people who didn't make it, but were also whose bodies were retrieved. I did receive a call from the ambassador of Yemen expressing to Canada, Dr. Nashah, expressing his admiration and appreciation to Canada. And it's very interesting to note that some 40% of the crude that is refined in Yemen is refined by Canadians. So it was tremendously important in terms of Canada in the world community that something like this happens by our Navy that has tremendous impact for Canadians on the ground. Bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I actually had a very interesting segue earlier on, because I happen to have with me one of Dr. Byers' books, which he has suitably inscribed to you, Mr. Speaker, and which I have as well. And we thought that might be an interesting memento for you today.
Handled by the Speaker of the Senate himself.
Yeah.
So I want you to have this on behalf of all of us, and thank you very, very much. And the Speaker mentioned the organization. This really wasn't a Bill Romke event. It was an old oars event, very much so, and I mentioned all of them earlier, and I'm going to call on Bob Duncombe in a minute to conclude, because Bob is our mess president, simply because he knows the procedures and he knows a lot more, and he's done a lot of work. He's been the treasurer, too, taking in all the money, which isn't insignificant. But I wanted to mention Stornoway Productions just passed me a note to say that they are here, and they are going to be upstairs, and they may be buttonholing you to ask you about your experiences with the UNTD, because they are doing, as I said before, a program, a television documentary on the I think it's on the UNTD. They may make passing reference to the COTC and the URTP, but essentially they're going to be upstairs later on. They may buttonhole you and want to do interviews with you, any anecdotes that you may have. And I wanted to say, and I should have said before I made the presentation to the speaker, that I neglected to read the last page of my notes, which talks about the Speaker and the Navy, because his website, as you will see, if you draw it up, the Speaker of the Senate has been a long-time supporter of the men and women who serve in the Canadian Navy, and notwithstanding that Senator Kinsella served as a member of the 112 Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, But the important thing is he saw the light. And he has always had a special interest in the Navy. He's visited the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, Canadian naval installations, and on board the following ships under the National Defense Program: Ville de Quebec, Fredericton, Kingston, Corner Brook, Windsor, and Victoria. He's a strong supporter of and he's been also on a Croatian naval vessel. So I wanted to mention that to you because I think that's important too. And now I want to call on our mess president, Bob Duncombe, otherwise known as Bobby Orr Starboard.
Thank you very much, Bill. Bill Romke was my cadet captain a couple of years ago, and actually about 50 years ago. But it was a wonderful time, and we sailed together very well and had a good time. Rough crossing from Pearl Harbor. Remember that? Pearl Harbor to Monterey? I looked at your website briefly yesterday, and I typed in Noel Kinsella in Google, and it comes right up. And then you go to the English, and it comes to the senator in the Navy, and there he is in the pictures on Ville de Quebec and Fredericton and at base Halifax. Last night I had and I want to thank you very much for presiding here today. That's really why I'm looking at you right now. Thank you for being the speaker in the best tradition of the term, keeping us on time. I had a dream at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's been solved. I woke up and I was dreaming that I was being pulled out of the room just as Dr. Byers got up to speak, and somebody said, "You've got to get out. Somebody else here wants to talk to you." And when I came back, he'd sat down. And I said, well, to the president, I said, what did Dr. Byers say? I'd like to be interested to hear what he had to say. And they said, we really don't know what he said. And I said, well, what do you mean you didn't know what he said? Well, he talked about the Russian threat, and he switched immediately into Russian and did his whole talk in Russian, and even his graphics on the screen were with the Cyrillic alphabet. And I thought, what? And I said, well, there's an opportunity in this problem. I think he brought some books along, and they're in English. So if you'd like to, find out what he said, read his books, and he'll probably autograph them for you too. And I think that's what happened. I think the books have come along, as I've just heard now. And I want to thank Captain Bertrand, because Captain Bertrand was not planning to be here today. He was going to be having a day off. But Captain Udock, who was in your program, as you may have noticed, we haven't said much about Captain Udock. He was very willing to come here today, but I understand the minister told the Admiral that I want something on my desk by Monday morning at 9, and some of us who've been public servants understand what that means. It means you work all weekend. And you have to find a Captain Bertrand somewhere to stand in for you, and you did a great job of standing in for Captain Udock. Thank you very much for being such a willing... On that note, I'd like to just mention one other person here who needs to be mentioned. I'd like you to stand for a minute, Gil. Gil Hutton is the extraordinary person who has brought us together beginning in the 75th anniversary of the Naval Service Act in 1985, when he organized a reunion in Halifax, and those reunions continued in 93 in the 60th anniversary of the Naval Reserve, in 00 for the millennium, in 04, which was supposed to be the 70th anniversary of the Naval Reserve. It had to move a year because of accommodation problems in Halifax. And I expect that he's now, I see there's somebody coming up to organize the 2010, this is it for all of us, the 2010 Canadian Navy Centennial. And just go to that website too, type in Google, Canadian Navy Centennial, and you'll start to see the information. And it is all about us and the Navy and Canada's Navy that Captain Bertrand has just been talking about. On that note, I think we should probably adjourn, Mr. Speaker. Is that what we should do?
Yes.
Oh, yes, by all means. Bob Whitten, you're looking at me as if you've got something you want to present. Why don't you get up and present a gift from the old oars and the people present to Dr. Byers. And Peter, if you would do the same for Captain Bertrand. Come right forward here, Dr. Byers, and let's do it over here. Do it right here. Yeah, that's right there.
Dr. Byers, it's with much pleasure that we present you with a small token of our appreciation for your most excellent and elucidating talk this evening. We'll all have a lot to think about now, and we thank you very much.
Dr. Byers, you'll be happy to know that that was presented to you by a UBC alumnus.
Yeah. Oh.
A UBC, from one UBC alumnus to another.
Thank you.
Now, Peter for Captain Bertrand.
This is really a curious set of circumstances. You're looking at a person who is in a situation where we'd all like to be calling the shots on your own gifts. When we were getting David Hudock, and David Hudock was going to come to speak to us, I consulted with this gentleman about what he thought was best. He's getting it. And anyone that's as erudite and fleet of foot as this man to do it as a pinch hitter, I think deserves it in the highest order. For most
As we leave the room, for those of you who need some plumbing attention, there's a door at the back here at the left, and if you go through the door, two double doors, and turn left before the double doors, you'll find what you need. And I think at that point we'll adjourn, and who will lead us out? The speaker will lead us out. We're being led to the speaker's suite of rooms, his apartment in the Senate, and remember, there's also the Senate itself is open for you to walk in and have a look.
So it's just out the door, and we go east or port and up one flight. Okay. So it's right about this.